The massive space station Nexus Prime hummed with activity as thousands of alien species went about their daily business. Towering Zephyrians with their crystalline skin caught the artificial sunlight, while small, furry Rilkans scurried between the legs of much larger beings. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the breathing needs of dozens of different species, creating a symphony of mechanical sounds that had become the heartbeat of this interstellar hub. In the darkest corner of the station's most rundown bar, a lone human sat nursing what passed for alcohol in this part of the galaxy. Marcus Chen had been on Nexus Prime for 3 standard weeks now, and every day had been the same story. No one would hire him. No one would even talk to him properly. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were still the new kids on the block, barely worth noticing. The bar itself was a perfect example of how humans were viewed. Called the Rust Bucket, it catered to the lowest forms of life the station had to offer. Smugglers, thieves, and worse gathered here to drink cheap liquor and plan their next illegal venture. The walls were stained with substances Marcus didn't want to identify, and the smell was something that would have made most humans sick. But Marcus had grown used to worse things during his time in the human military. "Look what we have here," a voice rumbled from behind him. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. He'd heard this tone before, in a dozen different languages across as many worlds. It was the voice of someone looking for trouble. 3 Coraxians had entered the bar. Each stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick, gray skin that looked like it could stop a bullet. Their forearms ended in claws that could tear through most metals, and their eyes glowed a dull red in the bar's dim lighting. They were mercenaries, judging by the weapons strapped to their massive frames and the military-style clothing they wore. "A human," said the leader, a particularly large Coraxian with scars covering half his face. "I thought they didn't let pets in here without their owners." The bar went quiet. Even in a place like this, everyone knew that picking on humans was becoming something of a sport among the tougher species. Humans were small, weak, and had no natural weapons. They'd only been in space for about 50 standard years, making them practically infants compared to civilizations that had been traveling the stars for millennia. Marcus took another sip of his drink and continued staring straight ahead. He'd learned that sometimes ignoring bullies made them go away. Sometimes. "I'm talking to you, little pink thing," the Coraxian growled, moving closer. His 2 companions spread out to flank Marcus, cutting off any escape routes. "My name is Vex Grimclaw, and I'm curious about something. They say humans are supposed to be warriors, but looking at you, I'm having trouble believing it." A few other patrons chuckled, but most kept their heads down. Nobody wanted to get involved in whatever was about to happen. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how the weak little human would handle 3 trained killers. "You know what I think?" Vex continued, now standing directly behind Marcus. "I think humans are just good at talking big and running away when things get serious. I heard about that war you fought against the Zellan Empire. They say you won, but I think it was just luck." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't turn around. The Zellan War had ended just 2 years ago, and it was still a sensitive subject for most humans. It had been humanity's first major conflict since joining the galactic community, and the casualties had been enormous. Out of a human population of 12 billion, nearly 2 million had died in that war. "Nothing to say?" Vex asked, reaching out with one of his massive hands to grab Marcus's shoulder. "Maybe you'd prefer to settle this outside? Just you and me?" "That wouldn't be fair," Marcus said quietly, still not turning around. Vex laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You're right, human. 3 against 1 isn't sporting. Tell you what, I'll fight you alone. No weapons, just hand to hand. When I'm done with you, maybe the rest of the galaxy will stop pretending humans are anything special." Now Marcus did turn around, slowly setting down his glass. He was average height for a human, maybe 5'10", with brown hair and dark eyes that seemed older than his face suggested. He wore simple civilian clothes, a gray shirt and dark pants that had seen better days. To anyone looking at him, he seemed like exactly what Vex had described, a weak, unremarkable creature who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. "Like I said," Marcus repeated, "that wouldn't be fair." What's not fair about it? Vex demanded, puffing out his massive chest. I'm giving you a chance to prove humans aren't the weaklings everyone says you are. Marcus stood up slowly. He was tall for a human, but, next to Vex he looked like a child standing next to an adult. The size difference was so obvious that several patrons started placing bets on how quickly the human would be knocked unconscious. It wouldn't be fair, Marcus said for the third time, because you wouldn't survive it. The bar erupted in laughter. Even Vex's companions started chuckling at what they saw as an incredibly stupid attempt at bravado. A human threatening a Caraxian warrior? It was like a mouse challenging a tiger. Oh, this is rich, Vex wheezed between laughs. The little human thinks he can threaten me. Tell me, pet, what makes you so dangerous? Do you have hidden weapons? Secret martial arts? Or maybe you're going to bore me to death with human poetry? Marcus didn't smile. His expression remained completely neutral, as if he was discussing the weather rather than facing down three aliens who could each probably kill him with one hand tied behind their backs. I was a Marine, he said simply. This caused another round of laughter, though it was a bit more nervous this time. Most of the bar's patrons had heard stories about human military forces, but the details were usually vague and, often contradictory. Some said humans were cowards who relied on technology. Others claimed they were savage beasts who fought without honor. None of the stories made them sound particularly impressive. A Marine! Vex exclaimed, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Oh, I'm terrified now. What did you do in your Marines, little human? Push papers? Clean weapons? Fetch coffee for real warriors? I was deployed to Kepler 442b during the Zellan occupation, Marcus replied. Spent 18 months behind enemy lines with a squad of 12. When extraction came, I was the only one left alive. The laughter died down a bit. Kepler 442b had been one of the worst battlegrounds of the Zellan War. The planet had been a human colony of about 50,000 people when the Zellans invaded. By the time human forces retook it, fewer than 1,000 colonists were still alive. So you're a survivor, Vex said, trying to sound dismissive but not quite managing it. That doesn't make you a fighter. That just makes you good at hiding while your friends die. Something changed in Marcus's eyes. It was subtle, just a slight narrowing, a fractional hardening of his expression, but, suddenly, the air in the bar felt different. Several of the smaller species began edging toward the exits, though they probably couldn't have explained why. My squad wasn't there to fight, Marcus said, his voice still perfectly calm. We were there to evacuate civilians. Refugees who'd been hiding from the Zellans for months. Families with children who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. He took a step closer to Vex, and, despite being less than half the alien size, somehow he seemed to take up more space in the room. The Zellans had established a garrison in the colonial capital, Marcus continued. 2,000 soldiers, plus armor and air support. Standard protocol was to call an orbital bombardment and level the whole area. Clean, simple, effective. But? Vex asked, and there was less mockery in his voice now. But there were still 300 civilians trapped in the city center, Marcus said. Families hiding in basements and emergency shelters, too scared to make a run for it. High Command said they were acceptable losses. Collateral damage. Marcus stopped directly in front of Vex now, close enough that the massive alien could have grabbed him without extending his arms. But, for some reason, Vex found himself taking a step backward instead. We disagreed, Marcus said simply. 12 soldiers against 2,000, one of Vex's companions asked. That's suicide. Not soldiers, Marcus corrected. Marines. And, we weren't trying to win a battle. We were trying to buy time. The bar had gone completely silent now. Even the background noise of the station seemed muted, as if the entire universe was holding its breath to hear what came next. The plan was simple, Marcus continued. My squad would infiltrate the city and locate the civilians. Once we had them gathered, we'd send up a signal flare. That would give the fleet exactly 10 minutes to extract everyone before the bombardment began. But something went wrong, Vex said. It wasn't really a question. Marcus nodded slowly. Everything went wrong. The Zelens had motion sensors we didn't know about. They detected us 3 hours into the mission. By the time we reached the first shelter, they had us surrounded. He paused, seeming to look past the aliens in front of him to some distant point in space and time. Johnson took a plasma bolt to the chest in the first exchange. Williams got cut down trying to drag him to cover. Chen, no relation, just coincidence, bought us 30 seconds by charging a Zelen patrol with nothing but a knife. I watched him take down 4 of them before they brought him down. Marcus's voice never changed. He might have been reading from a technical manual for all the emotion he showed. But something about that complete lack of feeling was more unsettling than any amount of anger or grief would have been. We kept moving, he continued. Every time we reached a shelter, we had to fight our way through. Every time we saved a group of civilians, we lost another Marine. But we got them out. All 300. And your squad? Vex asked quietly. Dead. Every last one of them, except me. Marcus's eyes refocused on the present, meeting Vex's gaze directly. I spent the last 6 hours alone, moving from building to building, hunting down every Zelen patrol I could find. Not to complete the mission, that was done. The civilians were safe. Then, why? Vex's other companion asked. For the first time since the conversation began, Marcus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Because I was angry, he said. Because my friends were dead, and someone needed to pay for that. Because humans don't forgive, and we don't forget, and when you hurt us, we hurt you back 10 times worse. The temperature in the bar seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile a predator might wear while stalking prey. I killed 43 Zelens that day, he continued conversationally. Not in fair fights. Not in honorable combat. I hunted them down like animals. I used their own weapons against them. I set traps. I poisoned their water supplies. I made them afraid to leave their barracks. Vex and his companions were backing away now, though they probably didn't realize they were doing it. Something primal in their brains was screaming at them to run, to get as far away from this small, soft creature as possible. When the orbital bombardment finally came, Marcus said, I was sitting on the roof of the garrison, watching the Zelen commander through a sniper scope. He was maybe 300 meters away, completely unaware that I was there. I could have killed him easily. Why didn't you? Vex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I wanted him to see it coming, Marcus replied. I wanted him to know that his entire garrison was about to be destroyed because of what they did to my squad. I wanted him to understand that humans don't just fight wars, we win them. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. Finally, Vex cleared his throat and took another step backward. I think, he said carefully, that maybe we were hasty in our judgment. Perhaps humans deserve more respect than we initially thought. Marcus's smile widened slightly. That's very wise of you. Yes, well, Vex stammered, we should probably be going. Places to be, people to see. Come on, you two. The 3 Coraxians practically fled from the bar, leaving behind an atmosphere of stunned silence. Slowly, conversations began to resume, but they were much quieter now, and nobody looked directly at Marcus. The human returned to his seat and picked up his drink as if nothing had happened. But word would spread quickly through the station, as word always did in places like this. By tomorrow, every being on Nexus Prime would know about the human who had made 3 Coraxian warriors run away just by talking. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his job prospects were about to improve dramatically. In a galaxy where strength was the only currency that mattered, he had just proven that humans possessed something far more dangerous than claws or thick skin. They had the capacity for absolute, calculated violence in defense of those they cared about. And, once the galaxy understood that, everything would change. As he finished his drink and prepared to return to his small quarters, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His squadmates were still dead. The colonists on Kepler 442b were still traumatized by their experience. The war was still a scar on human history. But, tonight, at least, the galaxy had learned something important about humanity. Something that would serve them well in the years to come. They had learned to be afraid. 3 days had passed since the incident at the Rust Bucket, and Marcus Chen was discovering that reputation traveled faster than light in the confines of Nexus Prime. What had started as whispered conversations in dark corners had evolved into something approaching legend by the second day. By the third day, Marcus found himself receiving job offers. The first offer came from a Trilaxian shipping company that needed security escorts for their cargo runs through pirate-infested space. The second came from a mining consortium looking for someone to handle labor disputes on their outer rim facilities. The third was from someone claiming to represent a private military contractor, though the details were vague and the pay was suspiciously high. Marcus turned them all down. He wasn't interested in becoming a hired gun or a corporate enforcer. He'd seen too much of what that kind of work did to people, and he'd spent too many years trying to forget the things he'd done in the war to start doing them again for money. What he wanted was simple, legitimate work that would let him disappear into the crowd and live a quiet life. That was why he was currently standing in the offices of Meridian Logistics, one of the larger civilian transport companies on Nexus Prime. The office was clean, professional, and populated by beings who wore business attire instead of weapons. It was exactly the kind of normal, boring environment Marcus had been hoping to find. "Mr. Chen," said Director Yalath, a tall, thin Zephyrian whose crystalline skin reflected the office lighting in interesting patterns. "I must admit, your reputation precedes you. However, I'm not entirely sure how that translates to qualifications for a civilian cargo pilot position." Marcus had been expecting this question. His military service was a matter of public record, and the incident with the Coraxians had only reinforced the image of him as someone who solved problems with violence. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it also wasn't the whole truth. "I spent 6 years in the Marines before the war started," he replied. 3 of those years were in logistics and transport. I've piloted everything from small scouts to heavy cargo haulers. I know how to navigate hyperspace routes, how to calculate fuel consumption for long-distance runs, and how to handle emergency repairs in deep space. Director Yalath consulted the tablet in front of her. "Your service record does support that claim. However, it also indicates that you spent the majority of your military career in combat roles. Why the sudden interest in civilian transport?" It was a fair question, and Marcus had prepared an honest answer for it. "Because I'm tired of fighting," he said simply. "I've seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. I want to do something constructive for a change. Moving cargo, delivering supplies to colonies, maybe helping establish new trade routes, that's the kind of work that builds civilization instead of tearing it down." The Zephyrian seemed to consider this, her large eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Zephyrians were known for their ability to read emotional states through subtle bioelectric fields, and Marcus wondered what she was picking up from him. "There is something else we need to discuss," she said finally. "The route we're considering for your first assignment runs through the Kepler Nebula. Are you familiar with that region?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Some of it. The outer edges, mostly. It's a busy shipping lane, but the navigation can be tricky because of the electromagnetic interference." "Indeed. It's also become something of a problem area recently." Director Yalath activated a holographic display showing a 3-dimensional map of the nebula. Red markers indicated dozens of locations scattered throughout the region. These represent cargo ships that have gone missing in the past 6 months. 27 vessels, carrying everything from food supplies to industrial equipment. "Pirates?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We believe so, though we've never been able to prove it. No distress calls, no wreckage, no ransom demands. The ships simply vanish. The Galactic Commerce Authority has been investigating, but they haven't made any progress." Marcus studied the hologram more carefully. The missing ships seemed to be scattered randomly throughout the nebula, with no obvious pattern to their disappearances. But there was something about the distribution that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "What makes you think I can handle something that stumped the GCA?" he asked. "Honestly? We're running out of options." Director Yalath deactivated the hologram and leaned back in her chair. "Every major shipping company has lost vessels in that region. Insurance rates have tripled. Some companies have stopped running cargo through there entirely, which means essential supplies aren't reaching the colonies on the far side of the nebula." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Your military background suggests you might be better equipped to handle hostile situations than our typical pilots. And, frankly, your recent encounter with those Caraxians has convinced some of my colleagues that you might be able to deter pirates simply by being there." Marcus almost smiled at that. If only it were that simple. But he understood what she was really asking. They wanted him not just as a pilot, but as a deterrent. Someone whose presence might make potential attackers think twice about targeting their cargo. "What's the cargo?" he asked. "Medical supplies for the colony on Kepler 442c. Antibiotics, surgical equipment, emergency rations. Nothing particularly valuable from a monetary standpoint, but critically important for the colonists." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Kepler 442c was in the same system as Kepler 442b, the planet where he'd lost his squad during the war. He'd be delivering life-saving supplies to people who were probably refugees from the same conflict that had cost him his friends. "What kind of ship?" he asked. "A modified Hermes-class light freighter. Good range, reliable hyperdrive, and enough cargo space for the medical supplies. We've also authorized some defensive upgrades, enhanced shields and a basic point defense system. Nothing military grade, but enough to discourage casual pirates." Marcus considered the offer. It was exactly the kind of legitimate work he'd been looking for, and the cause was certainly worthy. But something about the situation bothered him. 27 ships disappearing without a trace suggested something more organized than random piracy. "I'll take the job," he said finally. "But I have some conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "I want complete autonomy over route planning and departure times. If I think something looks wrong, I turn around and come back, no questions asked. And I want access to all the data you have on the missing ships, manifests, crew records, last known positions, everything." Director Yalath looked surprised. "You think you can find a pattern that the GCA missed?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'll just get lucky. But if someone is systematically targeting cargo ships in that region, there has to be some kind of logic to their operations. Pirates don't just attack randomly, they choose targets based on risk versus reward." "Very well," she agreed. "The ship will be ready tomorrow morning. Dock 7, Level C. The cargo is already loaded and secured." "How soon can you depart?" "As soon as I've reviewed the data and plotted my route," Marcus replied. "Probably tomorrow evening, assuming everything checks out." They spent another few minutes discussing details, payment schedules, communication protocols, emergency procedures. It was all standard bureaucratic procedure, the kind of mundane business that made up the backbone of interstellar commerce. But Marcus found it oddly comforting after years of dealing with military orders and combat briefings. As he left the Meridian logistics offices, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope for steady employment, but hope that he might actually be able to build a new life for himself. A life where his most dangerous challenge would be navigating asteroid fields instead of enemy fire. He should have known better. The data package from Meridian Logistics was more comprehensive than Marcus had expected. In addition to the basic information about the missing ships, it included GCA investigation reports, insurance claims, and even some survivor testimony from a few vessels that had been attacked but managed to escape. Marcus spread the information across the small table in his rented quarters and began the methodical process of looking for patterns. It was work he'd done countless times during the war, trying to predict enemy movements based on incomplete intelligence. The skills were the same, even if the stakes were different. The first thing he noticed was that the disappearances weren't actually random. While they were scattered across a wide area, they all occurred within a specific band of the nebula where the electromagnetic interference was strongest. That made sense from a pirate's perspective. It was harder for ships to detect threats or call for help in those conditions. The second pattern was more subtle. The missing ships all fell into one of three categories: small independent freighters, medical supply runs, or food shipments to frontier colonies. In other words, they were all carrying cargo that was either valuable to pirates personally or that could be easily sold on the black market. But it was the third pattern that made Marcus sit up and take notice. Of the 27 missing ships, 19 had been carrying supplies to colonies in the outer spiral. 8 had been headed to the inner systems. But all of them had been scheduled to pass through the same navigation beacon, Beacon 7744, located deep in the nebula's most electromagnetically active region. Marcus pulled up the technical specifications for Beacon 7744. It was a standard navigation aid, providing position data and course corrections for ships traveling through the nebula. Like all such beacons, it was automated and unmanned, powered by a small fusion reactor that should have kept it running for decades without maintenance. According to the data, Beacon 7744 had been offline for routine maintenance 3 times in the past 6 months. Each maintenance period had lasted exactly 72 hours, and each time, ships that should have passed through that area during the maintenance window had simply vanished. That was when Marcus realized what he was looking at. This wasn't random piracy. It was a systematic operation, carefully planned and professionally executed. Someone was using the navigation beacon as bait, luring ships into a specific area where they could be attacked without witnesses. The question was who? Pirates generally weren't known for their technical sophistication or their ability to maintain complex operations over extended periods. This kind of planning required resources, coordination, and access to GCA navigation systems. It required someone with inside knowledge of shipping schedules and route planning. Marcus sat back in his chair and considered the implications. If he was right, then the pirates weren't just stealing cargo, they were probably working with someone inside the legitimate shipping industry. Someone who could provide them with information about valuable shipments and help them avoid detection by law enforcement. It also meant that his own mission was almost certainly being watched. If the pirates had inside information about shipping schedules, they would know about the medical supply run to Kepler 442c. They would be expecting him. The smart thing to do would be to report his suspicions to Director Yalath and let someone else handle the investigation. Marcus had signed up to pilot a cargo ship, not to take on an organized crime syndicate. He'd done enough fighting for one lifetime. But, as he looked at the list of missing ships, Marcus found himself thinking about the crews. 27 vessels, with an average crew of 4 or 5 people each. That was over 100 beings who had simply vanished, leaving behind families and friends who would never know what had happened to them. And then, there were the colonies that weren't receiving their supplies. Medical equipment that never arrived meant people dying from treatable illnesses. Food shipments that vanished meant families going hungry. The pirates weren't just stealing cargo, they were destroying lives. Marcus had spent 2 years trying to forget about the war and his responsibilities as a soldier. He'd told himself that he was done fighting, that someone else could handle the galaxy's problems. But, sitting in his small quarters on Nexus Prime, looking at the evidence of systematic predation on innocent civilians, he realized that some fights couldn't be avoided. He opened a communication link to Director Yalath. "I need to modify our flight plan," he said when she answered. "I think I know what's happening to your missing ships." 2 hours later, Marcus was back in the Meridian Logistics offices, this time with a much larger audience. Director Yalath had called in her senior staff, along with representatives from 3 other shipping companies that had lost vessels in the nebula. Even a GCA investigator had been brought in to hear Marcus's analysis. "You're suggesting that someone inside our industry is working with these pirates?" asked Captain Thoris, a gruff-looking Caraxian who represented one of the larger freight companies. "That's a serious accusation, human." "It's the only explanation that fits the data," Marcus replied, pointing to the holographic display he'd prepared. "Look at the pattern. Every missing ship was scheduled to pass through the same navigation beacon. Every disappearance occurred during a supposed maintenance window when the beacon was offline. And every ship was carrying cargo that would be valuable to pirates. Maintenance records can be falsified, the GCA investigator admitted. If someone had access to our systems, they could schedule fake maintenance windows to create opportunities for attacks. But who would have that kind of access? Director Yalath asked. Someone with administrative privileges in the GCA navigation network, Marcus said. Someone who works with shipping schedules on a regular basis. Someone who understands the economics of interstellar freight well enough to choose the most profitable targets. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Marcus was correct, they weren't just dealing with external pirates, they were dealing with corruption within the very organizations that were supposed to protect interstellar commerce. What do you propose we do about it? Captain Thuris asked finally. We set a trap, Marcus said simply. We announce a high-value shipment through the nebula, complete with false manifests and shipping schedules. We make sure the information gets to whoever is feeding intelligence to the pirates. And then, we see who shows up to steal it. You're talking about using yourself as bait, Director Yalath pointed out. That's incredibly dangerous. Everything about this job is dangerous, Marcus replied. But, if we can identify the insider and disrupt their operation, we can stop the disappearances. We can make the shipping lanes safe again. He turned to address the room as a whole. I know what you're all thinking. You're wondering why a human who just wants to pilot cargo ships is volunteering for something like this. The answer is simple, because someone has to. Because letting this continue isn't an option. Because sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to fight back. The GCA investigator leaned forward. If we do this, you'll have full law enforcement support. We can position patrol ships at the edge of the nebula, ready to respond if things go wrong. No, Marcus said firmly. If the insider sees unusual patrol activity, they'll know it's a trap. This has to look completely normal. Just another routine cargo run that happens to be carrying something valuable. Then, you'll be on your own, Captain Thuris said. If these pirates are as organized as you think they are, you could be facing overwhelming odds. Marcus smiled the same cold smile that had made the Caraxians flee from the rust bucket 3 days earlier. Let them come, he said quietly. I've been outnumbered before. As the meeting broke up and the various representatives began making arrangements for the trap, Marcus found himself thinking about his old squad. Johnson, Williams, Chen, and the others, they'd all died trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Now, 2 years later, he was about to do the same thing. The difference was that this time, he was going to be ready for it. The modified Hermes-class freighter Lucky Strike drifted through the Kepler Nebula like a minnow swimming through an ocean of stars. Marcus sat in the pilot's chair, watching the swirling clouds of ionized gas create patterns of light and shadow across his viewscreen. Under normal circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Today, it just reminded him of how easy it would be for a ship to disappear in all that cosmic interference. It had been 6 hours since he'd departed Nexus Prime, and the trap was already in motion. According to the falsified shipping manifests that had been carefully leaked through normal channels, the Lucky Strike was carrying a shipment of rare earth minerals worth nearly 10 million credits. The actual cargo bay contained medical supplies and emergency rations, but the pirates wouldn't know that until it was too late. If Marcus was right about the insider, word of the valuable shipment would already be making its way through whatever network the pirates used to coordinate their attacks. If he was wrong, he'd complete an uneventful cargo run and have to admit that 27 ships had vanished for reasons he couldn't explain. He was hoping he was right. After 3 days of studying the data and planning this operation, Marcus was eager to see his theory tested. But, more than that, he was eager to do something about the pirates who had been terrorizing civilian shipping for months. The communication panel chimed softly, indicating an incoming message on the standard freight channel. Marcus opened the link, expecting routine traffic control information or weather updates from the navigation network. Freighter Lucky Strike, this is Nexus Traffic Control, came a crisp, professional voice. We show you approaching navigation beacon 7744. Be advised that the beacon is currently offline for scheduled maintenance. Please adjust your course to use alternate navigation waypoints. Marcus smiled grimly. There it was, confirmation that his theory was correct. According to the shipping schedule he'd filed, he wasn't supposed to reach beacon 7744 for another 4 hours. But, somehow, maintenance had been scheduled for exactly when he would be passing through the area. Nexus Control, this is Lucky Strike, he replied. Copy that. Adjusting course now. But, instead of changing course, Marcus continued on his original heading. If the pirates were monitoring communications, they would expect him to follow the traffic control instructions and use the alternate waypoints. What they wouldn't expect was for him to ignore those instructions and head straight for the beacon. It was a calculated risk. By continuing toward beacon 7744, Marcus was betting that the pirates had positioned themselves along the alternate routes, where they expected ships to be redirected. If he was wrong, he'd be flying directly into their strongest position. If he was right, he might catch them off guard. As the Lucky Strike deeper into the nebula's most electromagnetically active region, Marcus began his own preparations. The ship's defensive upgrades were modest, enhanced shields and a basic point defense system designed to stop incoming missiles. Against a well-armed pirate vessel, they wouldn't provide much protection. But Marcus had made some additional modifications that weren't mentioned in any official documentation. During his years in the Marines, Marcus had learned that the difference between survival and death often came down to preparation and improvisation. The standard defensive systems on the Lucky Strike might not be enough to win a fight, but they could buy him time. And time was all he needed to implement some of the techniques he'd learned during the war. The first modification was simple. He'd rigged the cargo bay lights to create the illusion of a much larger crew. By programming them to turn on and off in sequence, he could make it look like people were moving around inside the ship. Pirates generally preferred easy targets, and a ship that appeared to be heavily crewed might give them second thoughts. The second modification was more complex. Marcus had spent the previous day rewiring portions of the ship's power grid, creating what military engineers called a ghost signature. By carefully manipulating the Lucky Strike's energy output, he could make the ship appear on sensors as something other than what it actually was. To anyone scanning from a distance, the freighter would look like a small escort vessel, still an attractive target, but one that might have defensive capabilities. The third modification was the most dangerous. Marcus had removed several safety protocols from the ship's fusion reactor, allowing him to overload the system if necessary. It would essentially turn the Lucky Strike into a bomb, but it would also give him a last resort option if the situation became hopeless. He was checking these modifications when the proximity alarms began to sound. Multiple contacts, he muttered, reading the sensor display. 3 ships, closing from different vectors. Marcus's heart rate increased slightly, but his hands remained steady as he activated the ship's defensive systems. After years of combat, this feeling was almost familiar, the sharp focus that came with knowing that violence was imminent and unavoidable. The first pirate ship appeared on visual sensors as a sleek, predatory shape emerging from a cloud of ionized gas. It was a modified assault boat, probably originally designed for military use but now armed with weapons that had been acquired through questionable means. The second ship was larger, a converted cargo hauler that had been retrofitted with additional weapons and armor. The third was barely visible, staying at the edge of sensor range, probably serving as backup in case something went wrong. Freighter Lucky Strike, this is Captain Boss of the Independent Vessel Reaper, came a harsh voice over the communication system. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. Comply immediately and no one gets hurt. Marcus opened a return channel. Unknown vessel, this is the Lucky Strike. I'm on a legitimate shipping run under Galactic Commerce Authority protection. Please identify yourself properly and state your intentions. The response was immediate and predictable, a warning shot from the assault boat's main gun that passed just in front of the Lucky Strike's bow. The message was clear: surrender now or face the consequences. Last warning, freighter, Captain Boss snarled. Cut your engines or we'll cut them for you. Marcus had heard enough. Instead of cutting engines, he pushed the Lucky Strike's reactor output to maximum and threw the ship into a series of evasive maneuvers that should have been impossible for a cargo hauler. The modifications he'd made to the ship's power distribution allowed him to overcharge the engines temporarily, giving the freighter performance characteristics that no pirate would expect. "What the hell?" he heard one of the pirates exclaim over an open channel. "That thing's moving like a fighter." The assault boat opened fire with its main weapons, sending bolts of plasma energy streaking through the space where the Lucky Strike had been a moment before. But Marcus was already gone, using the nebula's interference to break sensor contact and disappear into the cosmic static. For the next 10 minutes, it became a deadly game of hide and seek among the swirling clouds of gas and debris. The pirates had superior firepower, but Marcus had superior knowledge of how to use the environment to his advantage. He'd spent months fighting in conditions just like this during the war, and he knew how to make the nebula work for him instead of against him. The first real engagement came when the converted cargo hauler tried to anticipate Marcus's movements and position itself to cut off his escape route. It was a good tactical decision, but the pirate captain had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Marcus was trying to escape. Marcus wasn't trying to escape. He was hunting. The Lucky Strike emerged from a cloud of ionized gas directly behind the cargo hauler, close enough that the larger ship's weapons couldn't be brought to bear. At point-blank range, Marcus fired the freighter's modest point defense guns at the pirate vessel's engine compartment. The shots weren't powerful enough to destroy the ship, but they were sufficient to damage its maneuvering thrusters and leave it drifting helplessly. Reaper to Talon, Marcus heard Captain Voss calling to his remaining functional ship. "The freighter's got teeth. Be careful." But the assault boat captain was either too confident or too angry to be careful. Instead of maintaining distance and using his superior speed, he chose to close with the Lucky Strike for a decisive engagement. It was exactly what Marcus had been hoping for. As the assault boat charged toward him, Marcus implemented the final phase of his preparation. The cargo bay doors opened, and dozens of emergency supply pods began floating out into space. To the pirate sensors, it would look like the freighter was jettisoning cargo in preparation for surrender. What the sensors didn't detect was that each supply pod had been rigged with a small explosive charge and a proximity sensor. Marcus had essentially turned his legitimate cargo into an improvised minefield. The assault boat flew directly into the floating pods at maximum speed. The first explosion caught the ship's forward shields, overloading them with electromagnetic pulse. The second and third explosions tore into the hull, venting atmosphere and leaving the pirate vessel crippled. "This is impossible," Marcus heard Captain Voss whisper over the communication channel. "It's just one human. How is he doing this?" Marcus opened a reply channel, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the same cold certainty that had terrified the Caraxians in the rust bucket. "Because you made the mistake of thinking that humans are easy prey," he said. "Because you've been attacking innocent civilians who couldn't fight back. And because someone needs to teach you that there are consequences for your actions." The third pirate ship, which had been hanging back as reserve, suddenly began transmitting on emergency frequencies. All ships, this is the Shadow. We are withdrawing from the engagement area. Repeat, we are withdrawing. This operation is aborted." But Marcus wasn't finished. These pirates had been responsible for the disappearance of 27 ships and over 100 civilians. They had terrorized shipping lanes and threatened the survival of frontier colonies. They had made the mistake of thinking that humans were weak. He was going to make sure they never made that mistake again. The Lucky Strike pursued the fleeing pirate ship deeper into the nebula, using every trick Marcus had learned during his military service to stay on target despite the electromagnetic interference. The pirate vessel was faster, but Marcus was more experienced at navigating in these conditions. The pursuit lasted another 20 minutes before the Shadow made a critical error in navigation and flew too close to a particularly dense concentration of ionized gas. The electromagnetic pulse overloaded their navigation systems, leaving them blind and helpless. Marcus positioned the Lucky Strike directly in front of the disabled pirate ship and opened a communication channel. "This is Marcus Chen, formerly Staff Sergeant, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force," he said. I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for piracy, murder, and conspiracy. You will surrender immediately and prepare to be taken into custody." "We surrender," came a terrified voice from the shadow. "Please don't kill us." "We surrender." "Good choice," Marcus replied. "Now you're going to tell me everything you know about your operation. Who's your inside contact? How long have you been hitting ships in this area? Where are you taking the stolen cargo?" The information came pouring out. Captain Voss and his crew had been operating in the Kepler Nebula for nearly a year, using intelligence provided by someone in the GCA Navigation Authority. They had a base hidden in an asteroid field on the edge of the nebula, where they processed stolen cargo before selling it on the black market. Most importantly, they confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the inside contact. The pirates had been receiving shipping schedules and cargo manifests from someone who had access to the highest levels of the navigation network. Someone who could schedule fake maintenance windows and redirect ships into ambush zones. By the time GCA patrol ships arrived to take the pirates into custody, Marcus had a complete picture of the criminal organization that had been terrorizing the shipping lanes. More than that, he had enough evidence to identify and arrest the corrupt officials who had made the whole operation possible. As the Lucky Strike continued toward its original destination, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Director Yalith just days earlier. She had asked why someone who claimed to want a quiet civilian life would volunteer for such a dangerous mission. The answer was the same now as it had been then: because someone had to. Because there were innocent people who needed protection, and Marcus had the skills to provide it. Because sometimes the only way to build a peaceful future was to fight for it. But there was something else, something he was only beginning to understand himself. For 2 years, Marcus had been trying to run away from his military past, trying to forget the things he'd done and the people he'd lost. He'd convinced himself that he wanted nothing more than to disappear into anonymity and live a quiet life. What he'd discovered today was that some things couldn't be forgotten or abandoned. The skills he'd learned as a Marine, the instincts that had kept him alive during the war, the willingness to put himself in danger to protect others, these weren't just parts of his military service. They were parts of who he was. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of predators who preyed on the weak and innocent. For most species, the response to that danger was to build bigger walls, hire more guards, and hope that someone else would handle the problems. But humans were different. When humans encountered predators, they didn't just build defenses, they hunted the predators down and made sure they could never threaten anyone again. It wasn't always pretty, and it wasn't always simple, but it was effective. As the Lucky Strike emerged from the Kepler Nebula and set course for its final destination, Marcus realized that he'd found something better than the quiet life he'd been seeking. He'd found a purpose. Word of the pirate operation's destruction would spread quickly through the galaxy, just as word of the incident at the Rust Bucket had spread through Nexus Prime. Other criminals would learn that attacking human ships carried serious risks. Other corrupt officials would think twice before betraying their responsibilities. And other humans, scattered across the galaxy, would know that one of their own had stood up and fought back. Marcus Chen had come to Nexus Prime looking for work as a civilian cargo pilot. What he'd become was something the galaxy had never seen before, a human who refused to be anyone's victim, and who was willing to make sure that no one else had to be a victim either. The age of humans being seen as weak prey was coming to an end. And the galaxy was about to learn what it really meant to challenge the species that had fought its way up from the gravity well of a hostile world to claim its place among the stars. They had mocked the lone human. Now they were beginning to understand why he should have been feared all along.